the brain from our buddy here, you won't mind, buddy, we can separate this into two hemispheres. And what we have here is a nice cross-section of what we see on the inside of the brain. So this is a mid-sagittal view. So when we look at lobes, again, we have frontal lobe, parietal lobe. Here's that parietal occipital sulcus. So this would be the occipital lobe. So frontal, parietal, occipital. And then we start to see structures in here that might look a little bit complicated at first, but let me walk through them with you one at a time. I'm just going to kind of go top to bottom here and work our way down. So right here we have something called the Corpus Callosum, big tract of white matter. We have the septum pellucidum. We have the fornix. And then we get into the area of the thalamus. In fact, in the middle of that is something called the interthalamic adhesion. We have an anterior commissure and a posterior commissure. Anterior, remember this is the anterior side. Posterior, again, posterior here. And then we get into the hypothalamus. So if this is the thalamus, this is the hypothalamus. From there we have something called the optic chiasm. Chiasm means crossing. In fact, let me show you real quick. If I took this brain and put it back together with the other hemisphere and quickly showed you the bottom side here. This is the optic nerve. And that optic nerve, if you can imagine my green pointer here being the nerve itself, it's going to cross, right, from one side to the other. And that cross at that point is the optic chiasm. That's the crossing point right there. Posterior to that, we have something called the mammillary body. And then we have the corpora quadrigemina. And then this starts to lead into the brain stem itself. So the brain stem itself has three main parts to it: mesencephalon, pons, and the medulla oblongata. Mesencephalon, it sounds like a long name, but think of it. Mesos means middle. In fact, if I drew a line like this, and I drew a line like this exactly through the brain itself, that would be about the middle of the brain. In fact, mesos means middle, and cephalos comes from the word encephalos. Encephalos means brain. So mesencephalon literally is the middle of the brain, or the midbrain. Inferior to that, we have the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. If you look posterior here, you'll see these tracts of white matter. Those are called the arbor vitae, or the tree of life, that runs through this structure. It's what we call the cerebellum. The cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum. Again, these tracts of white matter would be the arbor vitae. One last thing I didn't mention up here. This is the choroid plexus of the third ventricle and the pineal gland there. Now I mentioned the term right there, the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. This right here is actually known as the fourth ventricle. The reason I say ventricle, a ventricle is kind of like an open cavity. In fact, if you can imagine me tipping this to the side, and I drip, drip, drip water on here, that water is going to start to accumulate here. This is not perfectly flat. Hopefully you can see that. That water, and by the way, I'm not talking water, I'm talking cerebrospinal fluid, but that water would move through this area called the third ventricle, and it would work its way down this area right here. This is called the Mesencephalic Aqueduct. Do you remember mesencephalon? Okay, just posterior to that, the Mesencephalic Aqueduct. You can think of water moving through an aqueduct, or cerebrospinal fluid moving through this region, from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, and then eventually all the way down the central canal of the spinal cord, because this is the spinal cord at this point.